talking about urgencies, again, then the problem of power comes in very strongly. Literally, and more in terms of social reflection. And the most acute power that is now entering the USA, of course, is something that we just left when we left the television set, and we will get back to when we get home and seeing what happened in the southern states. And if Rita and Katrina were to be armed enemies with the same energy and power as they have right now, or as Katrina had last week, 2 weeks ago, there would be a world war. What I'm trying to say is that these kind of phenomena, these kind of events, might be wake-up calls, and not just to poverty and racism and vulnerability of the state and federal neglect in the South, but I do think to much larger issues. And it's not just natural disaster what is at stake, but a variety of urgencies that has been discussed widely in all kinds of media, in all kinds of programs, but hardly still within architecture. I'm talking about the very well-known urgencies like pollution, waste, climate change in terms of nature, the 1 billion people living in slums and the following segregation, the neglect of heritage, the closure of the mind, so of the intellectual mind in many respects, a lack of security in an age of terrorism, and what is at stake tonight also, the legitimacy crisis in politics and in governance in general. Architecture with a certain ambition for a long time tried to get things a bit out of joint and not dealing with these kind of very general discussions, but to make this kind of anarchistic acts, a kind of avant-garde ambition to get space out of joint. And my question would be that if the time is, and not space, but if the time is out of joint, to use a famous phrase from Hamlet, can architecture help to set it right this time? Let's take legitimacy question here, because that's a subject the closest related to power issues. It's one thing to help power expressing itself. It is a completely other thing to help it expressing, expressing corruption or absolute power. The lack of legitimacy today within power circles is endemic. We can talk about the speech of John Kerry last week in Providence, and how one of the main protagonists of the rivalist party in this country is let's say, expressing his doubts about the legitimacy of the present administration. We could talk about an article 2 days ago in New York Times about the crisis of legitimacy in the Chinese government, where lawlessness is the talk of the day. We could talk about the lack of legitimacy of the European Union today after the 2 lost referenda in Europe. We could talk about the loss of legitimacy in many nation states today, about the lack of reforms the United Nations is suffering from, and of course also many big companies like Enron, Tyco, WorldCom, Shell, Ahold, and more of that. So there is a kind of pandemic debate going on about problems of legitimacy, a crisis of legitimacy. And is architecture really able to refrain from engaging with that? Let me give you one anecdote to elucidate on that a little bit. A few years ago, I attended a conference in Korea, one of the ANY conferences, called ANYWISE, and it was a presentation by Peter Eisenman. And he told a story about a question that he once got from the colonel when he was fighting in the Korean War as a soldier. And the colonel asked Peter Eisenman, Peter, you are an architect. I want you to build the barracks. And Peter, after thinking, and he can always tell these kind of stories very eloquently, told our audience on that particular night in Seoul that he said, Colonel, I agree. I am an architect. That's why I won't build the barracks. This kind of distinction between architecture dealing with quality and not with quantity, to put it shortly, might today, in the light of these urgencies, a false question. It might even be an alibi for irrelevance. Today, architecture may respond differently. For a long time, architecture could claim respect of pursuing its own agenda, even in complete denial of the most immediate questions. But can it still? Only when it can equally claim a high degree of honesty, of course, not letting the world interfere with its aesthetical adventures. And this claim of honesty as a shadow of the claim of autonomy is dubious. And that's why other strategies may be invented. It is a big question if it is sufficient. It is a big question if it is sufficient to expand your scope, your territory, and your rhetoric. If meanwhile architecture does not address the questions that are in the mind and hearts of people every day. So I would advocate an architecture for change, which is larger than the dynamics of its own history. And architecture then that is representing the status quo. An architecture that may be part of the solution rather than the face of the problem. Architecture for a cause rather than for the corruption of that cause. An architecture with a purpose rather than for a career drive. And of course, it all boils down to the question, so what can it do? How can it deal with these kind of issues? And I hope we can reflect on that during our debate. Thank you.
Okay, we